Imagine one day your life turns from what it is today into a 3-year battle for your freedom against the prospect of over 20 years in prison for a crime you didn't commit. At first, everything you understood about the American criminal justice system has you believing that if justice prevails, you will be found innocent and you can clear your name with your family, your friends, and everyone in the public who's seen your name and face tied to crimes you didn't commit. You didn't know that it's really just a lie, that the burden of proof is on the prosecutor to prove that you're guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. What? You had to learn the hard way that the police and other law enforcement forces you were taught to respect could ever be involved in a scandal to fabricate this story against you and take the witness stand and lie to a court and its jury. You had to understand through this ordeal that this is the reason your lawyer was nearly forcing you to take the plea the government was offering. In the balance is your life. It is the high school graduation, college years that you no longer will be able to attend, and the wedding and births of grandchildren from your child that you won't see. What is the likelihood that after 20 years, your parents won't be around so you could embrace them again? Burn this imagination into your memory, because it happens far more often than you may think, and it could happen to you. Right now, it's the nightmare that a married couple is living through. And with the might of the federal government gunning for their freedom and everything they've built for their family, the only refuge they have besides the prayer group they are devoted to is the support of family and the weight of public opinion that, no thanks to our competitors in the media, has only been influenced by the one-sided perspective of the other news outlets' sources within the U.S. Attorney's Office. We in the Kandit News Group, bringing you this special as the first product of our team since incorporating very recently, bring you the 3 sides to the story, just as we will bring you 3 sides to every story we do in pursuit of the truth. Buenas noches, manana. Thank you for joining us. I'm Troy Torres. Tonight, the Kandit News Group brings you this true story of how high-ranking Customs Officer Lieutenant Henry Alvendia, who is now a convicted federal felon, conspired with his friends and former co-workers in the federal government to entrap Guam couple Raymond John Martinez and Juanita Kirigua Moser in an elaborate drug smuggling scheme that has the couple at the doorstep of their second trial in the District Court of Guam. It is a nightmare the couple and their defense team is fighting, and one that opens our eyes to the broken criminal justice system. The first trial against Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser ended in a hung jury, 6-6, on May 24 this year. The couple faces a second trial this October, just about this week. In reviewing hundreds of pages of trial transcripts and motions filed by both parties, our news team has been able to piece together the answer to this question and the reasons both sides of this case are fighting so hard to win. Let's start with the scene leading up to their arrest and for which the couple was indicted in federal court. The following events are compiled from numerous court documents in the case. The events in question didn't happen on Guam, but in Los Angeles, more than 3 years ago. On April 26, 2015, Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser arrived at Los Angeles International Airport from Guam. Federal agents followed them from LAX to Enterprise Car Rental and attempted to install a GPS device on their rental vehicle, but were unable to do so without the couple noticing. Between then and June 4, they went to Las Vegas to make arrangements for their wedding and came back to LA County to a city named Monrovia, where the couple stayed with Mr. Martinez's mother, awaiting Mr. Martinez's sister's graduation. It was around 8 p.m. the evening of June 1, 2015, that federal agents began watching and tracking the couple's movements from their return to Monrovia. About 3 hours later, the lead agent on surveillance, Homeland Security Investigations LA case agent Matthew Hernandez, and remember that name because we're going to bring it up a few more times. He installed a federally owned and operated GPS tracking device to the undercarriage of the van without a warrant. He and his partner then left the scene, and no eyewitness surveillance occurred on the couple until the morning of Thursday, June 4, 2015. On that morning, around 11:10 a.m., in the city of Torrance, California, police officer Ryan Schmitz of the Torrance Police Department pulled over Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser on the grounds that the van they were driving was speeding past the limit. The police car had no radar and no dash cam. The van was stopped just off Pacific Coast Highway on a side street named Madison Street. The Torrance police officers instructed Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser to step out of the van and to wait, seated at the curb. Officer Ryan Schmitz then radioed for a canine. About 30 minutes later, canine handler Officer Daniel Ricci of the Redondo Beach Police Department from the nearby city of Redondo Beach joined the traffic stop along with his drug detection dog, Blitz. Officer Daniel Ricci took his canine Blitz around the van for a routine sniff. Blitz began sniffing at the passenger side rear tire and worked his way toward the front. He stuck his nose into the open window of the front passenger side of the van and then moved toward the engine area of the van. Blitz then began sniffing along the driver's side of the van and moved toward the driver's side rear tire, where he alerted to the scent of drugs and began scratching aggressively at the undercarriage of the van behind the driver's side rear well wheel until a GPS tracker fell to the ground. At this point, Blitz's alert stops. These are the facts of the case agreed upon between the prosecution and the defense. What happens after this is in dispute. There is inconsistent testimony among the government's law enforcement witnesses from Torrance and Redondo Beach police departments who allegedly confiscated two buckets labeled Morton salt from the floor of the van behind the driver's seat. According to the prosecution, these buckets contained methamphetamine. However, the size of the buckets, the location of the buckets, who handled the buckets, where the buckets went, the weight of the substance found inside the buckets, the chain of custody of the contents of the buckets, and even the sequence of events were all disputed and contradicted by testimony after testimony of police and federal agents called to the stand about these buckets and the substance they allege is methamphetamine. In fact, the prosecution throughout the trial refused defense attempts to have the substance tested or even brought before the court for inspection. One officer testified that the buckets were of a 3-gallon size. Another officer testified that the buckets were 10 gallons. However, the buckets allegedly confiscated were 5-gallon buckets. Based on the alert by the drug-sniffing dog, Blitz, and the seizure of the alleged buckets that contained methamphetamine, Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser were placed under arrest. During the traffic stop in the city of Torrance, federal agents, somehow already armed with a warrant, executed a search of the couple's home in Tamuning, Guam. The agents found no drugs or drug paraphernalia, no straws, no pipes, no syringes, no baggies. Whatever probable cause that federal agents swore to a federal judge would turn up illegal drug activity did not exist, which speaks to the facts of the criminal history of Raymond Martinez and Juanita Moser. They had no such criminal history. All the government's witnesses testified to this under oath. They were not known to law enforcement officials in Guam or California as either drug users or drug dealers. So why did federal law enforcement officials even think to follow the couple from Guam to the cities of Monrovia and Torrance in Los Angeles County? Enter Henry Alvendia, the former Guam Customs Lieutenant and disgraced former U.S. Customs Special Agent, whose crimes of corruption Johnny Rosario of the Kandit News Group detailed in Part 1 of this 3-part special into the Alvendia corruption scandal. Mr. Alvendia and other Guam Customs officials, some of whom still work for or have ties to that agency, used their positions to do exactly what they swore they would defend us against. They allowed illegal substances to pass through our borders. They conspired with local businessmen to create a criminal enterprise that would benefit from this corruption. They used the color of their authority as law enforcement officials with police powers to leave our borders unprotected, and they personally benefited from this scheme that began in 2005 and ran until their indictment on April 29, 2015. Mr. Alvendia, 34 days before he set up Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser in California, was indicted along with 8 others in the largest police corruption conspiracy in Guam history. In the sealed indictment, Mr. Alvendia was charged with 12 counts of felonies, covering the gamut of corruption from fraud, wire fraud, bribery, extortion, and trafficking, all done under the color of law. The indictment, which was unsealed by District Court of Guam Chief Judge Francis Tydingco-Gatewood, summarizes a decade of organized crime committed by a team of customs officers, revenue and taxation enforcement agents, a shipping company, and a retailer. Mr. Alvendia was pointed out by the U.S. Attorney's Office, specifically by USA Fred Black, as the most culpable of the group, having benefited the most from the corruption and having been in the highest position of authority among his co-conspirators. The crimes he committed, according to the indictment, paved the way for the other 8 of the team who were indicted to commit their crimes of corruption. Essentially, in this decade-long criminal organization, Mr. Alvendia was pinpointed by the federal government to be the ringleader. But why would the U.S. Attorney's Office ask Judge Gatewood to seal the indictment of the biggest police corruption case in the island's history? What purpose did it serve? To keep the crime secret until the indictments were unsealed 6 months after they were given. We should note here that because no one was aware of the indictments, Mr. Alvendia was allowed to keep his job at Guam Customs for a considerable period, still getting paid and enjoying the privileges and authority he used to corrupt the agency. He remained the custodian of evidence and was still in charge of all the confiscated goods, including seized drugs. These lockers are the same ones that reportedly caught fire, destroying whatever evidence contained at the time. Mr. Alvendia was eventually allowed to retire. Part of the answer to why the government sealed the indictments for 6 months we can find in a plea agreement between Mr. Alvendia and then United States Attorney Alicia Limtiaco, signed by all parties 13 days after the indictment. Now, before going any further, we must note that the crimes committed by Mr. Alvendia and his posse have absolutely nothing to do with Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser. These are 2 different federal court cases. The indictments in the Alvendia corruption case were sealed because Mr. Alvendia himself had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators and to provide information to the government that would lead to the conviction of others. In exchange for the information and for entering a guilty plea to count 1 of the indictment, the United States government dropped the other 11 counts and will recommend favorable sentencing for the fraud conviction. The specific language in the plea agreement is that Mr. Alvendia will receive the, quote, maximum available reduction, unquote, of time to be spent in jail. His sentencing for this federal crime he was convicted of has been moved several times over the last 3 years because the amount of time he will go to jail depends on the outcome of the Martinez and Moser trial. He hasn't been sentenced. He hasn't spent a day in jail for his leading role in the largest corruption scandal to be brought before the district court in Guam history. And in all likelihood, Mr. Alvendia probably will never spend any time in jail for his crimes. Soon enough, we will know what sentence Mr. Alvendia will receive, because 3 years after the plea agreement, we now know that the trial Mr. Alvendia is helping the federal government to prosecute is the one against Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser. On May 12, 2015, when Mr. Alvendia and then U.S. Attorney Alicia Limtiaco agreed to the plea bargain, no one knew that less than a month later, Raymond Martinez and Juanita Moser would be entrapped in a drug trafficking scheme designed by Mr. Alvendia and federal agents that led to the couple's arrest, return to Guam, indictment, trial, and now their second trial coming up on October 11. At the time of the plea agreement, and by all indications for all their lives, neither Mr. Martinez nor Ms. Moser were known to be drug dealers or even so much as drug users. It was Mr. Alvendia who raised their names to federal investigators in the month prior to the June 4 traffic stop in the city of Torrance, California. Now, why would Alvendia set them up? Who was he protecting? How did this man rise to a level of prominence so regarded that even after confessing to ethical and criminal misconduct as a federal customs officer, he was not only reinstated to his job at Guam Customs, but bestowed with the trust of the use of the customs seal? Based on information available to the public since the October 2015 unsealing of the indictments, there were other Guam Customs officers who were involved in the criminal corruption enterprise. Paragraph 6 of the indictment, which applies to all 11 counts of the corruption charges, describes the scheme used by the 9 co-conspirators and tells the grand jury that there are, quote, other individuals, both known and unknown to the grand jury, unquote, who, quote, knowingly and willfully conspired to defraud and deprive the residents of Guam and the government of Guam of their right to the honest and faithful services of public officials through bribery and kickbacks and concealment of material information in violation of federal law. The federal government was after something, or rather someone or some people, who had yet to be indicted in the Alvendia corruption scheme. This provides the missing piece of the puzzle as to why the court sealed the April 29 indictments. They didn't want anyone at Guam Customs to be aware that there was an ongoing investigation. It all relied on whatever testimony Mr. Alvendia would be able to provide to federal investigators. But who? 3 years after the indictment, Assistant U.S. Attorney Fred Black gives us the rest of the answer in transcripts taken from the Martinez and Moser trial in a sidebar conversation among the defense attorneys, Mr. Black, and Judge Gatewood. The transcript in document 490 and can be obtained on PACER. On April 2 this year, during the cross-examination of Mr. Alvendia as the star witness against Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser in their trial, Judge Gatewood called defense attorneys Peter Perez and David Lujan, as well as the prosecutor, Mr. Black, to her bench and outside earshot of the jury. At 2:47 p.m., they began discussing Mr. Lujan's line of questioning with Mr. Alvendia. Mr. Black, in his arguments with Mr. Lujan, reveals to Judge Gatewood that someone even higher than Mr. Alvendia was within federal investigators' sights. Mr. Black tells Judge Gatewood and Mr. Lujan, quote, "You've got to remember, this wasn't a case against one guy. We were working a case against 9 people at the time, and we're expanding against all of them, and we were going to try and take your other client down, and it all kind of fits together." Mr. Lujan, surprised by the admission, anticipated what Mr. Black was about to say next. Quote, "Who is my client? Scambuluri?" Lujan asks. Mr. Black continues, quote, "He's the guy who was protecting him." "Sure, the guy that was protecting him. And so that's the whole reason that we had the break off, to protect his identity, and your clients decided they didn't want to cooperate," unquote. To be clear, when Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser were arrested in California on drug trafficking charges, they didn't even know Mr. Alvendia had been indicted, much less that there was any connection between a large corruption scandal and the charges they were about to face for drug trafficking. So when Mr. Black says that they refused to cooperate, it should be made clear that it's not that Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser were trying to be difficult or obstructive of any federal corruption cases. It was that they invoked their Fifth Amendment right to remain silent and wanted to speak to an attorney to find out what was going on, because they were never told why they were pulled over and why they were arrested. And the Scambuluri, to whom Mr. Black refers as the man who protected Mr. Alvendia and against whom the United States Attorney wanted to question Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser for their alleged drug offenses in California, is Ralph Scambuluri, the former head of the Guam Customs and Quarantine Agency. As the federal government would soon learn, there was no connection between Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser with Mr. Scambuluri. In fact, the only connection there was from the Alvendia corruption scandal to Mr. Scambuluri's involvement in the criminal conspiracy is Henry Alvendia. The feds were duped by their star witness. And with the Martinez-Moser trial set to be done by the end of this year, there is the possibility that the United States Attorney for Guam will have set free the most corrupt law enforcement official in our history, while losing a major and very expensive series of trials against Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser for alleged crimes that the federal government orchestrated and entrapped the couple into. How did this happen? We continue our pre-trial in-depth coverage into this miscarriage of justice tomorrow night. Stay tuned for this on our website, www.kanditnews.com. That's Kandit News, or via link from our Facebook page or Instagram feed at Kandit News. I'm Troy Torres. Good night.